Welcome to the webinar, the COVID-19 Pandemic and Global Supply Chains, Disruptions and Restructuring. This is a webinar organized by the Duke Center for International Global Studies. I'm the director of the center, and this particular seminar is part of a series called Rethinking Diplomacy, which is a new program that we launched last January, so a couple of months ago. The reason this is particularly relevant for the series, Rethinking Diplomacy, is because, as we know, trade and certainly global supply chains and all activities related to trade are part of long negotiations. And given the shock that the world has been experiencing recently due to the COVID-19, we thought that it was time to reflect on what has been going on, what's going on, and what will go on in terms of trade and global supply chain. This is, of course, it's a very major topic. So today we will focus on some aspects of this topic, and we hope that you will come back for other seminars that we will organize in the future. I will introduce the two speakers today, and then the two speakers each will speak for 10 minutes to provide the initial remarks. Then we will open the floor to questions that should send through the chat. So I will collect the questions and ask both speakers the question that you will send to me. Then the two speakers we have 7 minutes for a second round of remarks, and then we will open the floor for Q&A again. So we will try to cover as much as possible in 1 hour. So we will try to be extremely disciplined in our timing, and also in terms, I will not be able to ask all the questions that you will send to me through the chat room. I will do my best to summarize some of them, and hopefully we will continue to talk about this issue even after this webinar. Thank you to the two speakers. I will introduce them shortly, and I would like to thank the team of the Duke Center for International Global Studies for organizing this webinar. The two speakers, I will start with our guest from the IMF, Tamim Bayoumi. He has a distinguished career at the IMF and as a scholar. He has published several articles and books. I will not go into the entire bio because for saving time, but the bio is available on the website and also on through the webinar form that you use to join this program. I want just to say that currently Tamim Bayoumi is the Deputy Director in the Strategy, Policy and Review Department at the IMF. And he will say a little bit more about his activities if he wants, but certainly is involved in assessing trade and other policies related to the global economy. Gary Gereffi, I'm sure you certainly know Gary. He is a professor at Duke. And not only is a very distinguished professor, but is the director of the Global Value Chain Center at Duke. Gary is one of the leading experts in the world in terms of global value chain and global supply chain. And so between Bayoumi and Gereffi, we will certainly get a very interesting overview of what's going on. I will ask Gary Gereffi to start, and then for, as I said, 10 minutes, then Tamim Bayoumi will speak for 10 minutes, and then we will have Q&A. Gary, thank you very much for having accepted our invitation.
Thank you, Giovanni, and it's a pleasure to be part of the webinar. I'm glad that Duke is organizing this on such a key topic. So in my initial remarks, I want to cover 3 points. First, I want to address how this topic of global supply chains has created the phenomenon of globalization over the last 50 years that has become so popular in our discussions of the international economy. Second, I want to discuss briefly how crises disrupt global supply chains and what kind of crises we need to pay attention to. And third, focus specifically on COVID-19, the pandemic, and in particular, the topic of how COVID-19 has led to shortages of personal protective equipment and testing devices. It's a way for us to see how supply chains in the US context reflect some of the global topics I'll mention at the beginning. So first, global supply chains and globalization. I think it's useful to think of two models of the global economy. One model, if we go back to 1970, I'll call it the domestic economy model. And in 1970, the world economy was dominated by the production and trade of a handful of major industrialized countries. Most prominent at the time were the United States, Germany, Japan, and a handful of others. In this domestic economy model, most goods were produced inside the advanced industrial countries, and international trade was based largely of primary commodities going from south to north, from developing countries to industrialized countries, and finished manufacturing goods being sent from the advanced industrial countries to the rest of the world. So that would be a very simple domestic economy oriented model of the global economy. Since the 1970s, I think we've moved towards something that I'll call the global factory model. And this would be the model of global supply chains, global production networks that really creates this phenomenon of globalization. And I'll just characterize it very briefly. In the global factory model, US companies and companies from Europe and Japan began to move production offshore for a variety of reasons. But just to give a very simple account, offshore production began with simple assembly. And I'm just going to use the US example throughout. So in the 1960s and 1970s, the United States began to set up an assembly industry with Mexico. We called that the Border Industrialization Plant, or the Maquila industry, where US companies would send parts across to Mexico to be assembled there and reshipped back to the United States. Germany was doing something similar with East Central European countries. And this was a fairly common model of what we might call the first stage of offshore production. And that was 1960s, 1970s. As we move into the 1980s and 1990s, we move from a simple assembly model to what we might call full package production. More and more companies in the US and elsewhere began to offshore production, especially to East Asian economies, such as South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. And those companies could actually take specifications for products and produce the complete product. They didn't need to rely on US or other companies to send them the parts. That was accelerating in the 80s and in the 90s. And then by the time we got to the 2000s, China entered that mix as the largest exporter in the world, especially after 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization. China's exports just began to skyrocket for all types of manufactured goods. So China became the super exporter by the mid 2000s. So in a very simple way, we could see how this global factory model was producing international production networks that were replacing production that was just done from dominant industrialized countries. So the global factory model, I just want to mention a few of the key advantages, why it became so popular as a way to organize global international production and trade. First, it's a very flexible model. Production in the global factory model could move to those countries that were near needed natural resources, had large supplies of qualified workers, and were close to major end markets. Two, the global factory model could scale very easily. It was export oriented and network based. So even small economies like Hong Kong or Taiwan or South Korea or Singapore, because they were exporting to the rest of the world, could produce in very large quantities. 3, the global factory model is highly specialized, and this is really important. It meant that the different countries that were making goods in the global factory model often were producing specific components or very specific products as part of these larger production networks. And this specialized nature of the global factory model affected international trade in 2 key ways. And these will be my sort of last key points. 1, international trade became trade increasingly of components rather than final goods. So when people talk about things like global value chain trade, what they're referring to is the fact that by the 1990s, the majority of international trade of manufactured goods actually was components, not final goods. Why? Because even simple products were made in 5 or 6 different countries, and complex products were made in dozens of countries. And so we really had to rethink our notions of international trade. Second key feature of this new kind of global value chain trade is that it was trade coordinated by large firms. It wasn't arm's length trade. And this was really critical to the global value chain or global supply chain model. Some of those large firms that moved production offshore were big manufacturers, automobile companies in the automobile industry, or the aircraft industry, or the computer industry, or the pharmaceutical industry. We can consider those producer-driven chains. But a number of the big companies that coordinated these supply chains were retailers and brands. Retailers like Walmart or Tesco, big shopping supermarkets, or brands like Nike, Adidas, or Disney. So we had both producer-driven and buyer-driven chains. So the key image we're getting here is this is a network-oriented global economy where key lead firms have the power to coordinate these chains. And what makes this a global value chain is global value chain analysis tries to figure out in which countries of this international production network for different products is value created and captured, and how is it expanded. So if that's a very simple global factory model of the international economy or global value chain model, I want to say something about winners and losers and then move to the crisis points. This was a very efficient system at its peak. And the key winners in this sort of a model, one were those lead firms that were coordinating supply chains for different products. They were very profitable in this kind of a system. But another big winner were the consumers. Because of the efficiency of this system, prices were driven down very low. So imports were rising rapidly in US, EU, and elsewhere. But the system also had losers. One of the big losers were the workers in industrialized countries whose jobs were outsourced as these supply chains got created. Another big loser, sort of set of interest, actually would be the environment, because these highly specialized supply chains jeopardized environmental integrity in various ways. So we can kind of call this system hyperglobalization. Very efficient, but very fragile supply chains. So I want to come to the next topic, which is these fragile supply chains were also susceptible to disruption by different kinds of crises. And I'm just going to mention a few, but a very big important one was 2008, 2009. The global recession in those years actually began to impede the ability of the big exporting countries to continue to grow as fast as they had in the past in terms of export-oriented production. Think China, think other East Asian economies, think Bangladesh. Lots of countries that were tied into this system as exporters could not find markets for their goods in the US and Europe. So that kind of an economic crisis begins to disrupt these chains. And in the case of China in particular, one of the consequences was that they began to turn inward instead of outward. They went from an export-oriented model to focusing much more on domestic economy and also much more on high-tech production and innovation, not just low-tech exports. Second, political instability is another kind of crisis in this system. Any sort of political instability lowers foreign direct investment and trade. Third type of crisis is natural disasters. So the earthquake and tsunami in Japan in 2011 disrupted automobile supply chains for months because Japan was making key products that were only made in Japan, not being made elsewhere. But the final kind of crisis and the topic of our conversation today are global pandemics, like COVID-19, the health crisis. And as everybody has remarked that talks about COVID-19, it's a really unprecedented type of crisis because of its scale and its scope. COVID-19 has spread all around the world in a matter of a few months. It starts in November or December in Wuhan, becomes publicly sort of announced in early January, and 2 months later, the whole economy, global economy, starts to shut down. People have talked about this as a black swan event, something that occurs very, very rarely. So let me just go from introducing COVID-19 to particular issues in terms of US supply chains, just to illustrate the impact it has in particular countries. COVID-19 has raised a lot of attention to two types of products: personal protective equipment for healthcare workers, I'll call it PPE, and also testing devices of different sorts. In both cases, there were big shortages of these products. PPEs included simple products like gloves and gowns, intermediate products like the N95 masks or the respirators, and much more complicated products like ventilators, as well as the different testing materials to show whether people had COVID-19. What we've been seeing in the US, and I think this is typical of the crisis problem, is both supply side problems and demand side problems and how to deal with this PPE shortage. When we started to look for things like gloves and gowns, imports had closed off because all of the countries that were making these products began to have export controls. China was supplying both the US and the EU with about 50% of all personal protective equipment imports prior to COVID-19. So they were a big supplier. China and other countries were stopping those exports for a while, or they were certainly slowing down. Eventually, we found things like gloves from South Korea and gowns from Honduras, but it wasn't easy to find alternative suppliers. A more interesting part of the supply side problem was how the US began to look for the manufacturers to increase domestic production of those goods. The White House was trying to coordinate that search through this coronavirus task force, and in particular, the office of Peter Navarro. And it was relatively easy to find the big companies that made N95 masks, for example. The two biggest were 3M in Minnesota and Honeywell. Ventilators, we also had big healthcare companies like Medtronic and GE Healthcare, but ventilators were more complicated, so we began to look for auto companies like Ford and GM that could try to make those goods quickly. But in both cases, scaling up these big companies' supply chains was going to take 6 to 8 weeks because of the need to orchestrate this production. So what began to happen on the supply side is a lot of third-party vendors began to come into play that were making things like those N95 masks, but it cost 5 to 10 times what we had elsewhere. So yeah, in a sense, the supply side problem was, even if you could find firms to make these goods, it wasn't easy to get them to scale up in time. And I want to just mention one quick thing about testing material, because we keep hearing again and again that the critical aspect of controlling the virus to some degree is testing. There's two very specific materials, the cotton swabs and the chemical reagents, that we don't have in sufficient supply. So testing materials have been halted just because we can't find those two particular components. So it shows the problem of the hyper-specialization model. If you need particular components and you can't find them, the whole chain stops. One final comment on the demand side problems. I think this is something that was much more of a surprise, how much difficulty the US had in orchestrating the demand side for the problem. What we discovered was that because COVID-19 affected the whole country, all 50 states were declared emergency areas. Governors and mayors became critical conduits or leaders in saying where the demand was greatest. But in the US, we had tremendous problems agreeing how the federal system should coordinate incoming products from the federal government side and how it should be distributed to states and cities. So I'll come back to that later, but I think orchestrating both supply side, demand side problems in a crisis like COVID-19 introduces a lot of supply chain issues that really require some advance warning. Had we been able to start 4 or 6 weeks earlier, a lot of these problems would become far less serious. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you for this overview. And we will get back to the current situation and future scenarios in the second part of the program. And now I would like to ask, and first of all, thank you, Bayoumi, for accepting our invitation. I know it's a very busy time at the IMF, so the fact that you are taking 1 hour of this precious time to share your thoughts with us, it's very much appreciated. Tamim?
Well, thank you very much, Giovanni, and that I think that my remarks are going to very much complement Gary's. He had a view from the point of view of the people who are producing things. My perspective is going to be from the point of view of policy. And so I think that the two presentations will complement. Just to mention, although I'm a member of the IMF, these are my own views, not those of the organization, in case you had any questions about that in a webinar. So let's go back. Like Gary, I want to start a bit further back, but I want to start with something different, which is the creation of the World Trade Organization in the mid-90s. Now, before then, global trade had been expanding, but it had been doing it under a set of agreements called the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade. And in 1995, that changed into the World Trade Organization, which was an organization which not only set the rules, but also had an appellate body, which was essentially a legal system to set who was right or who was wrong in any dispute. And everybody thought that this would lead to a period of real expansion in the rules of the game on trade. Now, it did lead to a long period of expansion of trade. And as Gary was pointing out, what happened was you got the creation of these global supply chains, where in goods, very complicated supply chains were made to produce goods with little bits in lots of different places. However, the WTO was less successful in adapting to the other changes which were happening in the global economy. The way that the global trading system had moved forward traditionally was large multilateral agreements involving many, many countries. And the WTO tried to push the so-called Doha round forward, and in the end that collapsed. At the same time, the other thing which happened was that because the way the WTO was set up, it was unable to move forward with other important things which were happening in the trading system. For example, trade and services. So trade and services are about 1/3 of total global trade, but very little was done to actually make that freer. And again, they were unable to come up, for example, with another obvious thing, which was e-commerce. So they're unable to come up with a bunch of rules of the game on e-commerce, which everybody would follow, and therefore that would expand. So what we ended up was a world with more and deeper global supply chains and goods, but what was happening in the rest of the economy, digitalization, the move to services, this was really not being covered by the WTO. And that stasis had effects, particularly after China joined the WTO in 2001. Now, China, of course, had a somewhat different model from the typical WTO member in terms of having somewhat more of a state-organized market system. Now, as a result, the entry of China also created some tensions. These were surrounding implicit subsidies of goods through, for example, providing cheaper electricity to people who made things. Things like that. And the second was, along with that the US at least felt that a whole series of its legitimate concerns had not been prosecuted fairly at the appellate body. So the other thing which happened, in addition to this, was rising concern about whether the appellate body, which actually enforced the rules of the game, was being fair. And these tensions were rising already, and then in the last few years, they've really come out in the open in terms of rising tariffs and other trade restrictions, most notably the tariffs between the US and China, but certainly not the only set of restrictions. And secondly, growing US unhappiness with the appellate body led to them refusing to allow new judges to be appointed, to the point where the appellate body is now essentially non-functional because it doesn't have a quorum of 3 judges to actually make any decisions. It normally would have 9 judges, so having less than 3 is really quite bad. So what we've ended up with is a system where essentially the legal system is ground to a halt, and the rules of the game are more and more coming under question. So that's the first part of my talk, which is about the background. I then want to briefly talk about the size of the COVID shock, just to make you clear quite how big it is. And there I'm going to focus on emerging markets. And then finally, I'm going to have some talk about the trade in equipment and medical equipment and why what's happening is so bad. So just very briefly on the issue of the size of the shock. Here is a picture that has 3 panels. The one on the left is for emerging markets, the rise in COVID cases, and you can see a very exponential factor. The 2 other really important things which have happened are commodity prices have fallen, particularly as we know oil prices. We were talking yesterday about WTI in the US, West Texas Intermediate prices going negative. And also on the right, you can see a picture of the outflows of capital from emerging markets. And you can see from here that this is 3 or 4 times the size of the global financial crisis in 2008. So this is a massive shock. I wanted to briefly show you, we've actually got some virtually daily data on trade. And what you can see here is world trade imports. And in the middle panel, you can see China imports. And you can see the China imports went down, but not that much. What you can see on the right-hand panel is a complete collapse in Chinese exports as the lockdown occurred. And this is important because, of course, Chinese exports involve imports from others. So you can see how the supply chain was affected, or would have been affected. So with that, let me get to what's actually happened. Well, given the size of this enormous shock, on some level, it's exactly what you might expect, although it's slightly disappointing still. The first is many countries lowered constraints on imports of medical equipment. And this is what you would expect. You need medical equipment. Why would you start charging tariffs on it or continue to charge tariffs on it? More disappointingly, quite a few countries also put export restrictions on such medical goods. And that is unfortunate for 2 reasons. The first is, given the supply chains that Gary so correctly talked about, you're actually lowering the supply. If I can't get medical equipment which is half made from somebody else, I can't finish making it. So we actually managed to lower the supply of medical goods by putting on these export restraints. The second is, of course, even given that supply, the export restraints did not mean that they went to the places of most need necessarily. Now, prices are not the best way of allocating during resources during a crisis necessarily, but they're probably rather better than export restrictions. So we ended up with these 2 very negative effects on the world and on the response to COVID. And that impact on a on a fairly significant supply chain. It was last year's trade in medical stuff was $300 billion. That has very negative effects both on the response and, of course, on people, countries' trust with each other. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Tamim. Thank you. And I would like to open, thank you for also this overview. And as I said, we are going, Gary and Tam will provide more remarks later, especially on the current and the future scenarios. Right now, I have several questions, so we can go over some of them in these first 5-10 minutes of questions, Q&A. The first one is from Ambassador Pearson, who is asking, presently, what are the major points of agreement among countries for stabilizing, improving the global supply chains? Tam, would you like to start with this one?
Yes. Well, the basic question here is the degree to which countries are interested in a predictable rules-based trade system. So most countries in the world are interested in this because they see the value of having the win-win of having efficient trade across countries, which can make things more efficient. Unfortunately, not everybody is, and in particular, as we know, there is now a significant dispute between the Americans and the Chinese about their respective roles in the in the global supply chains, which has resulted, as I say, in the ending of the appellate body as a way of being able to decide disputes. So while most of the world has agreed to the rules of the game, one or two very important players still disagree with each other.
Thank you. Gary, there is one for you. Do you from Valentina De Marchi, do you expect firm strategies reaction in the midterm to be similar to those to other crises like recession, e.g. increasing role of domestic markets move toward different specializations?
I think that the nature of the COVID crisis as a global pandemic is probably going to lead firms to make even more dramatic changes in their strategies than they would have with things like the recession. In the recession, the downturns were 2 or 3 years, and often companies would find that they could move supply chains to other locations and try to rebuild in a relatively short amount of time. I think with this COVID-19 crisis, there's a much bigger rethinking of the role of companies and their supply chains. I think there's a lot more emphasis that's going to be placed on multiple sources of supply to deal with this kind of risk, diversify sources of supply. But I also think that there's a bigger concern around strategic components and strategic technologies inside these supply chains that's much longer term. And I think that it also kind of plays into the evolving strategy of China. China's own development strategy is moving very quickly away from being just an export platform for a wide range of manufactured goods for the rest of the world, and focusing much more on moving into the high technologies that are going to dominate the economy going forward. And I think a big part of this shift in both China and the US is the rise of the digital economy. And I think many companies are realizing that their response to this crisis is going to have to incorporate the role of the digital economy and also rethinking innovation in a much larger sense. So I think this is a much more significant rethinking of global strategies for companies than we've seen in the more localized natural disasters or or financial downturns.
Thank you, Gary. Question to both of you, so anyone could answer, from Professor Lickman. Both of you make reference to issues that imply the need for more coordination. How do you see that coming from or looking like?
Tam, do you want to go first?
Well, the obvious place with supply chains would be the WTO. And we do have a process where both Canada and the EU have proposed ways of bringing China and the US together and getting the appellate body restarted so that we actually have a rules-based system. You see, an international supply chain, as opposed to one within a country, really does need you to know what the rules of the game are in terms of trade. If you think that tomorrow you may get a 10% tariff on your components, you're unlikely to make them somewhere else. The WTO, of course, when I talked about these export restrictions, they are within the WTO's rights, and that within WTO rights. But those WTO provisions for temporary putting on export controls was supposed to be when one country experienced a shock. So that country might want to bottle up its own products because it was on its own. But when you've got a global shock, clearly those kind of export restrictions are so destructive in the way that I explained earlier.
And I would maybe just complement that by saying, I agree with the importance of organizations like WTO, but I think this need for more coordination involves both countries and firms. On the country side, another feature of the last few years, as we know, has been the rise of economic nationalism, but more importantly, the, I think, weakening of a lot of the multilateral economic agreements that have taken place. So since things like these preferential trade agreements and other kinds of international bodies have been weakened, I think there's more ground that has to be made up. I think we've lost a tremendous amount of capability at the inter-country level because of the weakening of a lot of these multilateral institutions. On the firm side, one of the things we've been seeing over the last 10 to 15 years is that companies have already begun a very serious process of streamlining or rationalizing their supply chains. Those lead companies that were often operating in hundreds, had hundreds of suppliers, were now saying that they really want to coordinate with a much smaller set, maybe 25 to 30 suppliers that are much more strategic and more capable rather than 300 to 500 suppliers. So I think that's going to make coordination a lot easier, but it also means that less places are involved in these supply chains because of the streamlining of the suppliers themselves and the role that lead firms are playing in selecting who they are.
Thank you. One more question, then we will start with the second round of remarks. So I'm sorry to some of you who have raised questions. I will try to ask them in the second round, but let's just do this one because it still refers to our first remarks from Professor Maleski. In addition to diversification of supply chains to new countries, do you think multinational corporations will invest more heavily in automation in both manufacturing and services? This would allow protect themselves from the human capital effects of these and future shocks.
Okay, I've been actually looking pretty closely at what's been happening with automation. The short answer is automation technologies have been advancing for a while, but they are still very far from taking over entire production centers. We've heard things like the rise of fully automated factories or dark factories as they're called. But in looking at different industries, what I've noticed is the industries that are already heavily automated, like automobiles and electronics, they've been leaders, but they really still focus on very specific products. And other industries that are more labor intensive, like footwear and clothing, surprisingly, the degree of automation has not advanced very far. And in some of them, one of the most notable cases, Adidas in the footwear industry had set up highly automated factories in both Germany and the US, in Atlanta. They operated for about 2.5 years and then they closed both of them down. Why? Because they said that they could not get the variety of products using automated production. So they're hoping to turn some of that automated technology to the larger Asian factories who could use it in a more selective way. So I think we're far from automation taking over whole industries, but it's making some big inroads in very selected processes.
Thank you. Thank you both for your answers. I would say let's move forward with our plan. Also because some of the remarks that you, both Gary and Tam, will provide will answer some of the questions that I've been receiving. Gary, would you like to start again for 5 minutes? And then
sure. Okay, and I think I'd just like to focus on how the United States might deal with COVID-19 supply chain disruptions going forward. And maybe make just a few main points. One, I think that these supply chain disruptions are going to persist, perhaps a lot more than we wish. Even within COVID-19, we have been hearing that once countries have moved past the first wave of infections, that you're going to have to be prepared for a second or third wave until vaccines are ready. So we're going to have to be able to deal with recurrence of COVID-19. And more generally, the idea that these black swan events, these rare disruptions that have such global reach, indeed are very few and far between. I think that's been proven not correct. I think we've been seeing black swan events are a lot more frequent than they were predicted. A lot of weather-related events, like in the US and elsewhere, giant hurricanes are becoming more frequent. The hordes of locusts we've been hearing about in East Africa rival anything that we've heard of since biblical times, the fires in Australia, etc. So I think because of climate change and other factors, perhaps supply chains are going to have to accommodate more serious and recurrent disruptions than they have in the past. So what does that mean? Point two, I think these supply chains have to become much more resilient. The kind of global optimizing model that I was describing up to the mid-2000s had very little redundancy or resiliency. So already companies and countries, I think, are beginning to move in a couple directions. One, alternative supply sources for key products, so that companies for a long time would always talk about a China +2 or a China +3 strategy, not wanting to become wholly reliant on any one particular place. I think building up safety stocks or these kinds of strategic reserves is a second way that you could deal with these disruptions. Very important, I think, is regionalization, or what we might call nearshoring. The global outsourcing model, the global supply chain was highly fragmented. I think there's a lot of attention being paid to bringing supply chains closer to home. And in the case of the US, that clearly involves Canada, Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. I think we're very fortunate as a region to have a number of countries that have a variety of resources and cost inputs that make a very strong regional economy. And finally, I think the whole issue of more domestic production in the US is definitely on the agenda. This is the reshoring option or finding strategic suppliers. I think we're aware that in a lot of these key industries, I mean, health is very obvious, but most other industries, you need to have a set of strategic suppliers that could be domestically located. But to me, the key question, and I'll end with this remark, is how do we decide who those strategic suppliers might be and what those strategic suppliers might make? I think it's a really big policy challenge for the United States and all countries, but we're seeing it very clearly here in the US. You know, who would coordinate the strategic assessments that would need to be made to talk about how to strengthen and revitalize US industries, US manufacturing industries for sure, but as Tom already alluded, new manufacturing industries involve high levels of services. So we have integrated manufacturing and service industries. So I think the key question is, on the one hand, we can't retreat from globalization. I think the advantages of producing internationally, whether globally or regionally, are very critical. But we also need to think about the strategy for rebuilding domestic capabilities in the US and who would coordinate that process, both in the government and in the private sector.
Thank you, Gary and Tam. And I want just to add, Tam, before, I've been getting a lot of questions about whether we are going back to regional blocks. Just as you want to. Thank you.
Well, let me make 3 brief points, and maybe I'll think about how to put regional blocks into that. The first is the definition of security is going to widen. There are always carve-outs for products which are part of security. All of a sudden, I think medical products and things like that are going to become part of that definition of security, just as technology goods were beginning to become part of it in some parts of the world. The risk is that legitimate concerns about security will turn into industrial policy. And that's something which was something which was very prevalent in some areas of the world in the 60s and the 70s, proved relatively unsuccessful. But I think that some version of saying we want this produced with our own people in our own place, so this very much regionalization is the risk. And the reason that that's a very big risk is that at least some of the research which I've done suggests that while the costs of getting components from Vietnam instead of China may not be that big, reshoring has really significant effects on costs and productivity. So that a real move towards sort of going back to the earlier model of production pretty much onshore probably would involve significant losses of economic welfare.
Thank you. And would you like to address a little bit the regional blocks? Sure.
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously Europe is already a regional bloc. I mean, NAFTA is already a regional bloc. The question was that whether those are going to move back into being more closed. And I think there's going to be a certain amount of that going to happen in a world in which the certainty of the future of general trade, open trade, is less certain. You may be more certain if you're in Europe that you can get stuff from Bulgaria without a tariff than you can get stuff from China without a tariff, frankly, or without a restriction. You know, the EU would probably hang together in terms of what the restrictions were outside. So yeah, I think that, you know, a certain amount of regionalization, I think, is, you know, almost inevitable.
Thank you. Gary, would you like to add?
Sure. On that same point, I think there's two ways to think about regional blocks. One way is to think about them as political arrangements. And I think those have been reconstituted in some different ways, but I think they have real staying power to a certain degree. But from a value chain point of view, we've been seeing for the last 15 years or more, the idea that regional value chains, in fact, have been more and more important in terms of trade and investment decisions compared to fully global chains. If you look at the automobile industry in North America, it has been fully regionalized or increasingly regionalized since the mid-60s when we had our initial agreements with Canada, through NAFTA in '94, and now involving a lot of Central American countries. If you look at the aerospace industry, Europe and US both have very regional aerospace value chains, and the East Asian electronics industry is a very regional value chain. So I think because of the advantages of proximity, it makes sense that a lot of these supply chains are being set up with close neighbors. The only final point I would make on that, though, is geography isn't fully determining of what the regional value chain should be. In some key industries, there are very important global suppliers. So if you look at global services, India has emerged as one of the most important countries in the world for a lot of back office or advanced services. Any company that's actually setting up R&D centers and services, they're going to be in India as well as China, as in a few other places. So yes, regional blocks or regional value chains will become more important, but we still need strategic partners depending on the industry that could be anywhere in the world.
Thank you. One question is about, do you think consumers of healthcare products were winners as value chains went overseas? Prices kept going up, drug shortages, so not clear if that was the case. Probably Gary, you want to?
Well, just quickly, I think that a very persistent advantage of global outsourcing has been the costs have come down and quality has actually stayed quite high in a lot of these products. So I think in general, yes, consumers probably have benefited. I mean, even those PPE products that we were talking about, in the global production model, companies like 3M or Honeywell were being able to produce those surgical masks, the N95 masks, for 50 or 60 cents each on a global model. Now that things are coming back to the US, the cost is going to be 5 or 10 times higher. So I think, yes, there's cost advantages, but the security issues come back into play as well. Security is worth paying additional amounts of money for. So I think we need that. And I also think that we need the capabilities in our workforce that are being lost when we let industries leave entirely. So I think it's more complicated than just the economics and the cost in terms of figuring out the best arrangements for these supply chains, and especially how to bring national capability or regional considerations into play.
This one, I think, for Tam, it's looking forward. So how will supply chains react to the eventual reheating of economies around the world and the wide range of stimuli strategies that drive these reboots?
Well, I think that the impact on supply chains will be twofold. The first is, as Gary was saying, that they will be more careful about having single suppliers due to shocks. This was actually something which the US supply chain between the US and Canada had in automobiles, where they had production capacity on both sides of the border, and depending on the exchange rate, they produced in one or other country. So I think that kind of setup, which is rather different from the really super efficient supply chains we've seen in over the last few years, I think that kind of somewhat more somewhat less efficient but more multiple supply chain is likely to be the way that people will likely to be the place where people are going.
Thank you. This is also for time, I would say. What explains the upward slope on the global imports data in March, April, given that national shutdowns have accelerated post-China's lockdown?
Oh, I think that was a reaction. I think that's a temporary reaction. That's a good eyes. I think that was probably a temporary reaction. We had the big fall in Chinese imports, and then there was this big rise, which I suspect was somewhat of a restocking of some of the global supply chains. We saw that exports came down pretty fast, and I think that the bounce back is probably temporary. And remember that this is virtually daily data. I mean, we're getting this from ship signals, ship communications.
Yeah. 2 more questions. I would say probably this is for Gary. What rules, protocols, and practical measures can we put in place globally to facilitate cargo trade to continue under the current pandemic?
Cargo trade?
Yeah.
I'm not sure exactly how the regulations should be strengthened. But yeah, I know that in terms of the medical supplies, since that's a highly regulated industry, they've been doing extra checking at ports. And in fact, this is one of the things that's come up with the export controls. One of the rationales that countries have been given for doing export controls is that they wanted to double check shipments, so I think that those kind of security procedures are probably improving just as our technology for scanning shipments improves. I think that's more of a progression rather than something specific to the COVID issue.
Thank you. The last question is a big question, but it's from my friend Lawrence Baxter, and this is a good question to end our program. Is, will this roll back globalization?
Sorry, what was it again?
Will this roll back globalization?
I'll give a quick reaction. I don't think it's going to end globalization but I definitely think it is underlining the risks of globalization and the need to make globalization more responsive, I think, to domestic production needs. So I think we're going to get a rebalancing. We're going to go from the extreme forms of globalization to something that combines both nearshoring and reshoring. So, and on supply chains, going from making them more fragile to more resilient and redundant. I think that's a key.
Tam, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, globalization is a funny term. I think a lot of what we thought of as financial globalization in the early 2000s turned out to be the European banks doing loans that they shouldn't have been doing on any basis. And some of that was pulled back after the 2008 crisis and then sort of restarted. I think, again, there's going to be a pullback. There was a massive expansion in global trade in terms of components. I think some of that's inevitably going to come back. But, you know, the underlying technological forces behind both more financial interactions and more trade interactions are probably pretty powerful. So I would call it a pause rather than a rollback.
Thank you. And I would like just to conclude saying that because we are the Duke Center for International Global Studies, of course, we are very much interested in globalization, and we will continue this type of conversations with our guests throughout the summer. And in fact, we will look at different, the impact of COVID-19, but in light of what has been going on for some time. In fact, I will call this the shock of the global, number 3, and we can elaborate about the first 2. But certainly there are reasons why at this point we are experiencing all these issues at once. So having said that, I would like to say thank you very much to both Tam Bayoumi and Gary Gereffi for taking the time to share their expertise with us. Thank you very much to all the participants. And I'm sorry we couldn't answer to all the questions, but we will try to collect them, and perhaps we will answer in future programs. And thank you very much. Stay tuned. And thank you very much to the DUCIGS team and all the other friends who have helped organizing this event. Thank you. Bye-bye.